So, like 12 to 13 years ago, I thought it would be a good idea to start learning Japanese. Meaning I've spent about half of my life also paying attention to the online communities that are centered around learning Japanese, as well as watching some of the influencers who vlog about Japan from a foreigner's perspective. And during this time, I've noticed a few weird things about what it's like to learn Japanese parallel to these types of online spaces. I think because so many people online are talking about learning Japanese, and because Japan itself is often presented as some kind of lifestyle, the Japanese language ends up in a bit of a unique position where the act itself of learning Japanese basically has a kind of fandom. And it really seems that the demand generated by this fandom for foreigner perspective Japan content long ago outgrew how much stuff there is that a foreigner can even say about Japan or learning Japanese, which means a lot of conversations repeat themselves in this fandom. And there's a very common Q&A type of exchange in particular that comes to mind. It generally boils down to something like, how do I stay motivated when learning Japanese? Well, have a motivating reason to learn Japanese, and remind yourself frequently of that reason. This advice is then often followed up with such examples as speaking with Japanese people or moving to Japan, and we'll put a pin in this, so for now just keep in mind that learners of Japanese who are engaging with this online community are often encouraged to have some kind of end goal with learning Japanese, usually moving to Japan. And I'm guessing the people who ask this kind of question where motivation is the main thing they believe to be holding back their progress are not being pushed by an external force, like already living in Japan or having a lot of Japanese speakers in their real life. This type of hobbyist is who I want to focus on in this video, and I think the question itself, how do I stay motivated when learning Japanese, is kind of revealing of the fact that a lot of people in this hobbyist position struggle to enjoy the act itself of language learning. I think that comes down to just a simple lack of awareness of what they should reasonably expect from themselves and their own experiences, which will cause burnout and feelings of dejection. And to elaborate on that point, why don't we now go into great detail about my experience? Originally, I picked up Japanese without giving it much thought. I don't even remember the very first time that I would have began looking up resources about how to learn Japanese. It was very much just a thing I suddenly found myself very into. I wasn't thinking of becoming fluent or doing anything in particular with Japanese. Because I was so often being exposed to the language online, anytime I could understand something without needing to look it up was just rewarding enough on its own terms. And I think that no expectations mindset was perfect at keeping me motivated and pushing me beyond a lot of the beginner's pitfalls. Because it wasn't actually a matter of being motivated, I was just having fun and being rewarded in a really organic sort of way. But this is kind of at odds with that common piece of advice you might hear that you should have a really strong, motivating reason to study Japanese. And every time you feel demotivated, I guess just close your eyes and imagine how impressed your peers will be that you've learned a foreign language instead of doing anything useful with your life. I think the word motivation alone really speaks to a certain mindset people can fall into with Japanese. I mean, the way that some people talk about learning this language, it sounds like they're on a diet and they need to just grit their teeth and bear the pain until it's over. It really does seem that a lot of hobbyists of Japanese make sense of the whole experience as an act of discipline rather than of pursuing a hobby. But okay, am I saying then that the key to learning Japanese is to not have any discipline at all and just like watch a bunch of anime, man? Well, no, obviously, learning a foreign language does require some conscious effort, and rest assured that I've put in my fair share of effort. But after having been at this for so long and having studied under a few different contexts and mindsets, I can safely conclude that my productivity has suffered the most when I thought I had a good reason to learn Japanese. How can that be? Well, as a pretty directionless teenage weeaboo who spent a lot of time watching YouTube vlogs, I, like many others, was eventually sold on the idea of moving to Japan to teach English. You can apply to these programs with any bachelor's degree, so I thought I'll cruise through a Bachelor of Arts by majoring in Japanese. So for a while, I was at university in a beginner's Japanese course that I was way ahead of, just kinda wasting my time, being a vaguely insufferable presence in the classroom. And when I wasn't doing that, I was still doing my own independent study of Japanese to a maniacal extent. I mean, at the time, I assumed in just a few short years I would be moving to Japan, so I wanted to get there knowing as much Japanese as possible. And finally, I thought, I have a good reason to be doing this, a real reason to learn Japanese, something that's going to push me further and motivate me. But during this period, I suddenly took on a very granular approach to how I engaged with Japanese. When reading, I was suddenly no longer able to let myself gloss over any little kanji or term I wasn't 100% sure of, meaning getting through one page of text turned into an hour-long affair of research that ultimately left me feeling exhausted after having actually read far less material than I used to. Suddenly, it was extremely important to me that I was able to track exactly how many kanji I could recognize, how many of the 2,000 odd Joyo kanji could I cross off of my list. Very quickly, Japanese stopped being a supplement to my pre-existing interests, and it turned into this unproductive mania. Even though I was studying so hard back then, I look back at that point in my life and I know I barely retained anything that I studied. Your approach to learning a language cannot be reduced to some kind of collectathon. You cannot memorize a bunch of kanji in a vacuum removed from any context and seriously think you're going to retain that in the long term. And at some point I realized I was wasting my time and I needed to reevaluate what studying Japanese even meant to me. Why did I even want to move to Japan in the first place? Should I even move to Japan? I learned a lot about myself when I was at university. Not to the point that I knew what I wanted out of life, but I gained enough awareness to know that moving to a foreign country to enter into an extremely suffocating work culture might not be the thing that's going to fill the void inside of me. But the point of this video isn't to say university and burnout made me give up on my dreams and you should too. No, I mean, I didn't really give up. It's more like I stopped seeing Japanese as something that I even could give up on anymore. I kept studying and engaging with Japanese. I started reading purely for fun again. I stopped treating kanji like Pokemon cards to be collected. And in 2021, about a year after I left university, I began translating the obscure manga series Nekojiru. And this project ever since has pushed my reading abilities further than I ever assumed they would get. And then maybe you hear that and you think, so all along what you really needed was to find the right good reason to learn Japanese. And to that I say, kind of, but I think that would still be severely missing the point. That being, nobody on Earth expects you to be fluent at Japanese. So here's the thing. If you decided to start learning Japanese, you definitely already have a perfectly adequate reason for what you're doing. You probably already engage with Japanese through anime or music, and wanting to feel closer to a language that you're frequently being exposed to is as good a reason as anything else. I think it's easy to end up comparing yourself to weird things when you're engaged with some kind of fandom that surrounds what your hobby is. There's a lot of dubious language learning advice floating around out there, and if you aren't careful to filter out the unhelpful stuff, it can be more difficult to get yourself back on track when you've hit a wall. But I'm not trying to boil this whole issue down to a matter of this fandom and its influencers are bad. No, even in the best of circumstances, there's just so many things about Japanese that make it difficult to learn. Everyone who decides to study Japanese is going to at least once struggle through a period where they aren't sure how to progress, or are studying in a kind of unproductive way. And there's just no avoiding any of that. I don't believe any foreigner can sit down and think, okay, I'm gonna teach myself Japanese, and then have a completely straightforward experience where they never struggle or never inadvertently waste their earned time. But it's worth examining some of the common attitudes that are floating around in this community. So let's return to that piece of advice. You should have a motivating reason to learn Japanese. I think to me this is such a strange thing to say because it kind of implies that the person who was already interested enough to be asking those types of questions might not have a very good reason for wanting to study Japanese, and maybe they need to go and find one. If you're trying to change yourself so you can learn a language, you've got it backwards. Learning a language should change you. It should deepen your relationship to whatever things you're already interested in, and chances are you already have a bunch of interests that could easily be supplemented by even knowing just basic Japanese. But okay, I've now spent quite a while explaining that the way people think about things is wrong, and I'm sure you're wondering, when is this jerk going to bring his own ideas or advice to the table? And I do have one piece of advice I would humbly like to offer the Japanese learning fandom. It's kind of an endorsement of something that feels a little discouraged by this greater community. I'm sure it has a real linguistic term, but that kind of research is beyond the scope of this think piece, so I'm just gonna call it asymmetric proficiency. So I read a lot of Japanese text for a lot of different reasons. Reading Japanese is at this point a pretty natural part of my life. But I've never lived in Japan, meaning I have approximately 0 reasons to speak Japanese aloud. I can get some everyday uses out of writing, mainly for googling stuff online, but I don't usually need to write anything more than a sentence long, unless I'm specifically doing it to practice Japanese. Because of all that, I consider myself proficient at reading, but am far less adept in all other areas of the language. And I think this type of asymmetry is quite common, and it seems to cause a lot of learners a lot of anxiety. But I think accepting and expecting this asymmetry is an important part of learning Japanese as a foreigner who doesn't even live in Japan. There is a fine balance that needs to be struck. Obviously, it's worthwhile to spend some time training the areas of the language that you use the least. But I understand that my strength is in reading, and training that area is going to give me the most rewarding feedback loop, where the effort I put in cleanly transfers into a higher proficiency in a skill that I use every day. Whereas if I spend a few hours training my speaking or listening, while by no means a completely futile exercise, I am much more likely to forget the things that I practiced because I simply use those skills way less often. I think it's the instinct of a lot of hobbyists to feel as though they shouldn't push ahead with the area of the language they excel in, because it generates this kind of imposter syndrome feeling, where it probably doesn't feel like you're excelling at something, but rather that you're behind in everything else. But a language is comprised of many different components, and if you want to learn a foreign language, it's definitely worth being aware of what components benefit you and what components you, as an outsider to that language, have little to no use for. So, in conclusion, I think if anyone ever asked me, how do I stay motivated while learning Japanese, I wouldn't urge them to find a worthy cause to keep them in a perpetual state of mania, but I would encourage them to investigate why they feel demotivated, and to maybe adjust their approach in a way that's more organically rewarding for them. I think a lot of learners of Japanese would really benefit from reevaluating their own expectations and relationship to learning the language. A foreigner in their bedroom who just studies a lot cannot really be expected to somehow become fluent in all areas of Japanese, and the existence of such a person kind of defies all logic. Consider that a lot of people who feel like they're struggling with Japanese picked up English as their second or third language effortlessly. And of course, this is because English is so prevalent that even if it isn't the language of somebody's country, it's probably not exactly foreign to them either, and they're able to extract a lot of use out of it. Whereas with Japanese, on top of it being a pretty unique language with a steep beginner's learning curve, it also is really only spoken inside Japan, which makes it far less straightforward to pick up as an outsider. Truly, if there was ever a wrong reason to study Japanese, it's probably wanting to be fluent. But here's the good news. Since you never will be fluent and nobody expects you to be, you get to forget about all of this and just have fun with it. You're free to appreciate everything you've already learned as a triumph of your own dedication, because you're not going too slowly, you're not behind, you don't need to study so hard that you hurt yourself. There is no time limit. It's not that serious. You are, in fact, just a nerd with a hobby. And it's not my intentions with this video to crush the dreams of any weebs who might be watching, but to simply redirect that passion into a more sustainable and grounded mindset. Japanese is an extremely cool language, and I want everyone who's interested in it to enjoy learning it, and maybe speak a little less about it like it's some kind of exercise in misery. And those are just about all of my most concise thoughts on this matter, all wrapped up nicely, but if I seriously still have your attention, then do give me an extra couple minutes, just to make 2 points briefly that I felt I had to cut from this script for the sake of a good flow. Point number 1, if you're planning on applying for the JET program or similar, I'm not saying don't do that just because I didn't. There were a lot of other factors that led to me making the decision that I did. And if I were in more stable life circumstances, I probably would have made the informed decision to just give it a try anyways. Moving to a foreign country is a very cool thing to do. Anyone in the position to try it should try it. Though I will encourage you to check what other visa options your country has with Japan. These days, you don't necessarily even need a degree to work in Japan. And point number 2, I have a feeling if this video gets negative feedback, it's going to be a lot of, well, just live in Japan for the rest of your life and you'll become fluent, or, no, you just need to replace all media in your life with Japanese media and start only speaking to Japanese people. Look, if that's what you want to do, then fine. I guess this video isn't really for you. I'm just noticing that a lot of people seem to be burning themselves out in the exact same ways. And I don't pretend to be the first person to notice any of this. Like I already said, this fandom has reached total content saturation, and no conversation had in here can be unique. Topics like how not to waste your time while studying Japanese, or retrospective examinations of one's own weeby overzealousness, are all previously covered ground. But you watched this video to the end anyways for some reason, so thank you. I hope you got something out of it. By the way, if you're interested in reading Nekojiru or you're interested in my translations, then check out this website, and there's also a handy Twitter page. I'll have links to both of those in the description. And if you want to support my translations or these YouTube videos, then check out the Patreon. I put out a video on Patreon once a month. I talk more in depth about some of the research that goes into my translation process. Last month I did a room tour video, and this month's video is an extended version of the video you just watched now. I talk a lot more about learning Japanese in general, and that video is out right now, so if you want, you can go check it out. Alright, the video is over for real now. Bye.